Hi everyone, welcome to Module 5 of Introduction to Law. And this module we're looking at legal research. And this is an interesting topic because it's a very difficult one to place in the course, because in many ways this is a skill you need in week 1, but in other ways it's a skill that's not going to make any sense without the context of what we've done over the last 4 weeks. So I guess one thing to say about legal research is it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not a spend a week focusing on it and you learn it all. It's one of those ongoing skills that you learn over time, and it's part of that whole notion of research generally. So legal research, of course, sits within the broader notion of research and sits in parallel to other disciplines forms of research. So particularly for the criminology students, but also for the law students, there's a need to be able to move between those research spaces. Now, you will look at research in different disciplinary ways, and I know the criminology students have a whole subject that focuses on criminal intelligence and criminal justice research, so that's good. And the law students will also have a second year unit that comes back and focuses on those legal research skills in detail, because obviously we can't do everything at the start, and a lot of things are only going to make more sense once you know more about the field. So what we're going to talk about today, I guess, is first of all that question of what legal research is, and I want to look at the different layers there are to that concept. Second, I want to look at briefly at the concept of active reading, and we'll talk about that. And third, I'll look at the concept of zones of uncertainty, something that the textbook doesn't really cover, but something that I find is really, really important to think about when you're looking at understanding the law. Okay, so before we go any further, of course, make sure you've read the chapter in the text, but also go back and have another look at the primer that I referred you to in the first week. Obviously, it wouldn't have made a complete amount of sense at the time, and now's the time to go back over it and have a look through that, because that's really where I've distilled my couple of decades of experience of legal research and tried to really focus that in on what is the most straightforward way of presenting this to people at the start of their justice careers. So make sure you have a good look at the primer. It also has a section on writing essays and writing essay topics. That's going to be important at the end of term, because you've got short essays to write for that short essay paper, and that the last part of the primer gives you some ideas as to how to go about structuring those essays. All right, so the first topic I wanted to talk about was that idea of layers. That when you talk about research, there are different aspects to it. So there are at least 3 different strong aspects to the concept of legal research. There's the technical aspect, which is the pure, where do I find the information, how do I find it? There's the legal literacy aspect, which is, what does the information mean? If I can find it, but how do I use it, how do I interpret it? And it's those first two layers are very much interdependent, because you need to understand how the knowledge systems works before you can find it, but you need to be able to find it to understand it. So there's a complex connection there. And the third layer, I'm sure there are more layers, but the third layer I've identified in research is the project management sort of study skills layer, as to, well, how do you methodically run through that process and manage that process of finding information. And I'll make some comments on each of those in turn. So first of all, the technical layer. That's the, where do you find the information? And one of the biggest obstacles for people who have grown up with the internet is the idea that Google won't find you everything. And it's even more lethal in the legal world, because Google will find you the answer some of the time. And a lot of the time it'll be completely off the answer, but you don't necessarily know how to tell one from the other. So there are existing methods of accessing legal information using official databases, using official legislation, using the official reports, and some of those are subscription based, but as a student you have access to those subscriptions, so you have no excuse to keep just Googling things at this point. And as I said, like, it can be quite lethal because people can get a certain amount of away just by Googling things and find out, oh, look, I found the same thing as everyone else. I'm clever, I found the shortcut. I didn't actually have to look at Westlaw or the official database or the legal encyclopedia or whatever. I got the same answer as everyone else. But when you don't get the right answer, you don't know that you've got the wrong information. And you know, apart from you don't trust everyone on the internet, there is definitely a sense in which you need to be able to do the work up front and learn how to access those databases and learn how to access it. And I'm not going to talk it through here, obviously, because the information's in the books and the primer. And do it now when you have an opportunity to ask questions, because again, I have taught the second year legal research subject, and I often get very, very embarrassed students who in their second year don't know really basic things, and then it's very embarrassing in your second year to go, oh, I don't know how to do this really easy thing because I've just tried Googling things and just tried to fudge it as I went. So at least at this point you're a novice, so it's fine to ask for help and to say, I don't know how to do this, and we'll help you. But the further you go, it gets more and more embarrassing, and certainly if you manage to squeeze through graduating, always taking shortcuts, it becomes very, very difficult when you get caught out in the real world, when they say, don't you know how to do this? And one of the classics is legal encyclopedias, which are very useful but have a very steep learning curve to learn how to use. So now is a good time to have a look at those and to figure out how they work. Again, when you have access to support where people will be able to talk you through it. And this is something I'll probably have a chat about in the workshop. Luke might as well. But legal encyclopedias are really useful because they have all the answers there, and they're really, really updated all the time. But the actual interface to get to those answers is less than desirable. So that's the first concept, is those technical how do you find things, and the answer is you need to be able to use the accurate way of doing things. You have to be able to find the official reports. OSLI, which is a free information service, is quite good in terms of having a lot of information there. But for instance, when you look at the court, the judgment reports, it doesn't have the head notes. It doesn't have some of the information that the official reports have in them, because they're things that are written by the court reporters. So even in that case, you're still, OSLI is really convenient and it's very democratic and it's great, but you're still better off going to the official reports and getting it into all those other resources, let alone the noting up services, which are things which let you, when you look at a case, see if it's been discussed subsequently, because obviously they're not going to discuss things that are in the future at the time of the case, but those noting up services can say, this case is no longer valid, it's been overruled, or it's been discussed and been redefined. And certainly I know when I was in law school, this is more relevant to the law students than the criminology students, but when I was in law school, I had some very sadistic lecturers who set us assignments on law that had been changed in the last few months. So people who just went to the obvious resources and went to the textbooks, or we didn't have Google back then, or who had basically Googled, failed because they missed the fact that the law had changed recently and it had been set up as a trick to catch people whose research skills weren't very good. I don't think any of our people do that, but you still don't want to be in that situation. All right, so knowing how to use those databases, knowing how to access them, it takes time, it takes actual practical application to do, like so many things. It's again that analogy of, I must be really good at baseball because I've watched hundreds of hours of TV of watching it, therefore I must be really good at it. Reading about research or listening to videos about research is not going to get you very far. You need to be able to do it and identify the things that you can't do. The second layer of research wanted to talk about was literacy, legal literacy. And that's the concept of being able to understand what these terms mean, and to understand what ratio and obiter is, and to understand, what happens when cases get, well, when legislation gets amended, and all those sort of things. Now, you've got a little way down that journey, and in the rest of the term, we're going to take you further down that journey. So I know next module you're going to look more specifically at some of those interpretive issues, and that's something that's going to come back again and again. But again, it's something that it goes beyond the purely technical, and it's something that you pick up over time and through application. And again, online learning is great, but you need to not just sit back and lurk. You need to be able to access these things. And, I don't want to be, the nagger about this, but that's one of the problems of it. It's easy to sit back and go, what's the minimum I need to do to pass and just to get through this? But university is actually an opportunity for you. It's a safe space for you to experiment and to have guidance and to get help. And there's been more than one student who's graduated thinking they're very clever by taking shortcuts, and realised that they then no longer have access to the help they need to do the basic things that they should have learned how to do. So, as I said, I don't like nagging people about things, but I do think it's important to remind us from time to time that when you get really caught up with, what do I have to do to get my assessment done to get through, that assessment is only really there as a secondary purpose of university. University is here to get you to learn how to do things, and hopefully assessment will test some of those things, and it'll inspire you and motivate you to learn those things. But assessment's only the tip of the iceberg. You need to be able to get in and practice. So those legal literacy skills are things that you'll develop over time, and you'll develop that understanding of how the information system works and what it means, and and so on. The third layer I wanted to mention was project management skills, and that's just the simple, how do you go through that research process? How do you set aside the time? What do you start with, and then where do you work from one thing to another? And I've referred you previously to the College Info Geek website, which has heaps of really interesting videos on project management, time management, motivation skills, and everything else. So in terms of the study skills side of things, there's great stuff there. And I know for the law students that we cover that stuff again in a bit more detail in the legal research subject, where we have room to think about those things a bit more, and you've had a bit more experience with working with law at that point. But again, just flagging that idea that actually having a process and being able to manage that process is a really important part of research, because it's never X marks the spot. It's never Google it and that's the right answer. It's always a question of being able to say, well, what do I need to find out? What do I need to do first? One example of this, I think, is use of things like textbooks and Wikipedia. And I'm sure in other areas you'll have people say, never use Wikipedia, you should never use Wikipedia as a research source. But Wikipedia is great for a first cut at a research topic. And for areas that aren't covered in detail in Wikipedia, your textbook's good for that as well. But both of those sources are limited in many ways. Textbooks, by the time they get published, they don't get updated. Wikipedia has that uncertainty over, whether the information is absolutely, accurate. And in both cases, you're not going to have the technical depth or detail that you need for most research projects. But there is nothing wrong with doing that first pass with a general source, and then using that as a way of developing a strategy and drilling down further. So again, when you're developing those project management skills, those strategy skills, you can do things like you can start with, okay, how are we going to identify those key concepts, and then how are we going to identify what we're going to focus on. And the textbook actually talks about a very important research skill, which is knowing when to stop, and that's part of time management. And a lot of people come a cropper by you've got 5 things to cover, and they spend 2/3 of their time covering point 1, and then they realise they've run out of time. This is also in exams as well, and in assignments, and it happens all the time, that when people don't manage their time or apportion their resources, you can end up spending a lot of time on something that's only going to get you a small amount of marks, rather than focusing on the things that are going to get you the marks across the board, or the answer that you need across the board. So anyway, just flagging that as another aspect of research that's important. There's a model in the textbook that's Statsky's cartwheel, and I think that's quite useful as a way of figuring out what it is that you need to know, so that you can then go back and plan your process around that. So have a look at that. Alright, so the second of the points I wanted to make was on active reading, which the textbook talks about quite well. And I just want to reinforce those ideas that reading as a researcher is not the same as reading fiction, or reading for pleasure, or reading as you might ordinarily do it. That if you just open up your book and sit there and start reading it, you're not going to get very far before your brain wanders off into other spaces. You know, if you've got a 40-page case to read, you might get to page 3 before your brain's just wandering around and thinking about other things. And if you then realise, oh, I've taken nothing in the last couple of pages, and I'm going to go back to the start and start reading it again, you'll never get anything finished. So active reading is active note-taking. And not just using a highlighter, by the way, because if you do that, you'll just start colouring in. And you get to the point where, again, your brain switches off and you're just highlighting everything that looks important, and you're just colouring in every sentence before long. So active reading is, starting out with a skim read of the whole thing to understand the landscape of the thing you're reading. What are the important parts of it? How do they relate to each other? Don't try and understand any of the concepts in detail on that first pass. Write down some notes. Actually, writing notes is an important part of active reading, because it engages your brain and actually makes you focus on the things that are important. So come back and make those notes. Use those notes to identify the things you need to focus in. And this is something that's really specific for law, but it also applies to other things, is that every text that you read has multiple purposes. So legal cases are a classic of this. Someone will set you a high court case to read, and the case will be about 3 different areas of law, but you're only interested in one of them, or maybe one sub-area of one of them. So you can waste a lot of time getting very confused about all this other stuff, about taxation law or something else that's in this case, where the person who set the case is not intending that you read that. They're intending that you focus on whatever it is, the defamation aspect that's of that particular case. So active reading is very important in being able to filter and be able to say, okay, is this part of what I'm reading this for or not? Is this important? Does this actually connect into it? If it's not, I can probably skim it and just get a general gist of it and come back to it. But maybe I need to reevaluate that later on. Maybe I'll realise that was more important than I thought, and I'll come back and review that. So active reading helps you deal with that complexity, and in any kind of reading that you do will always have multiple different things in there that are not necessarily what you need, and that becomes really important when you're researching, not just as a student but in the actual real world, because you need to be able to sift through that the things you're reading are not going to be set out nicely and laid out in a way that's easy for you to walk through by a teacher or a mentor who's helping you, find a path through the forest. You're going to have no path when you come to actual real-world research. So it's, again, very important to be able to filter these large amounts of information and focus in on what you need. So that's active reading. The last thing I wanted to mention was the idea of zones of uncertainty. Again, this is a concept that's important for all sorts of research, but is particularly important for law. And that is understanding what are the key things that are uncertain and what are the key issues that are up for grabs, and what are the things you really focus on. So in reality, most law jobs don't involve any research, because most people who work in law or in the justice fields are working with the same areas of law all the time. So if you're a lawyer who works within family law all the time, you're going to know before long which are the sections of the Family Law Act you need to know about, and what are the procedures and the paperwork that's required for a divorce or whatever. If you work in the justice field and you work in enforcement, you're going to know which of the regulatory areas that are the ones that you're going to use all the time, and you're going to know what the sections are, and so on. And often what people are where there is research, it's within that field. It's like, okay, this is a little different to what I usually do, but I know the area and I know where to look. So one of the weird things about research is that, in the world of professional practice, it's like this tiny little, there's a pie chart, there's this tiny little section which requires research. But that section is really vital that you know what you're doing when you need to do that research. So it's worth thinking about where the zones of uncertainty are on a particular question. So most of the question is going to be reasonably settled. Most of it's going to be something that you're going to find a straight answer to. But the important stuff is the things that it's going to be unsettled. So you've got that, that pie chart, 99% of it's settled, 99% of it we all agree on. But that 1% is so crucial, and that's where uncertainty is, and that's where change happens, particularly in law. And the history of particularly of common law development is a history of situations where everyone thought the law, just assumed the law went a certain way, and then some bright spark took an issue to court and it went up through the appeals process and said, well, everyone assumes it's like this, but if you actually look at it, it's actually quite different. And we get cases, like Donoghue and Stevenson, the case that founded the idea of negligence. I mean, years of cases where courts had just said, of course there's no concept of negligence. There isn't. It's ridiculous. And then someone presented an argument in a particular way, didn't listen to what was the obvious Googled answer of the day, using your Victorian Google, 19th century Google, that an advocate ignored what was conventional wisdom and took an argument and managed to make it stick and created a whole new area of law. Now that's extremely unusual to actually happen, but I think it illustrates the fact that it's in those little areas of uncertainty where change takes place. A more mundane example is the areas in legislation that often use what the rest of us would probably call weasel words, where it's like this term includes X, Y, and Z, and anything that seems to be reasonably connected to those things. So most jurisdictions have a Weapons Act that says you're not allowed to take weapons into public places. And the obvious cases, that 99% where if someone wants to sling a broad a battle axe over their shoulder and pretend they're a Viking and walk down the main street to the shops, those really obvious cases are always covered in the clear words. But there was a series of cases in the late 70s, early 80s, where that definition was put to the test, because it basically, the definition of weapons said, knives, clubs, whatever, and anything else that's a weapon. And this was at the birth of the punk movement, and the studded belt became, one of the go-to fashion items. It was before hair metal had all the studded belts and studded wristbands. And there were a whole series of prosecutions where people from the punk movement were prosecuted for carrying a weapon around because they had a studded belt. And, went to court. And eventually the courts were bewildered by this whole thing and decided that a studded belt was in fact a weapon. Because the judges clearly had no idea why someone would want studs in their belt. So the actual case law was a bit of like one of those cultural mismatches, but it was also one of those things where ordinarily people would say a belt isn't a weapon, even with studs in it. It's just a studded belt. But that area of uncertainty became very, very important. And it became very, very important for the punk movement, for police control of the punk movement, and for clashes between, youth cultures and the police in that particular era. And it was all because of that little area of uncertainty in the legislation. And law needs those in order to work. You need to be able to have some flexibility, but you also need some sense of certainty. So that to sort of close that point on zones of uncertainty. Zones of uncertainty are where the research is all at, and your basic research, your Googles and your Wikipedias and your scanning of the textbooks will get you through those 99% of the cases where, this is the everyday way things work and they work the same way all the time. But research is about that small area, and in terms of being self-interested in a student, assessment is also about those areas. We don't tend to set assessment tasks on the normal areas, the everyday areas. What we do is, because they're not very interesting and the answers are very simple, where we set assessment is on those edge cases and on those uncertain areas, and that's where your research skills are important. So have a go, play around, try and access some of that information, work through the materials in the primer and the book, and then have some questions, and you can ask the questions on Teams and talk about those questions in workshops. But it's this is definitely one of those areas where learning is by doing.